What we need to see is inflation coming down in a clear and convincing way.
I think that bringing inflation down should be our number one priority.
The story of inflation is changing.
A year ago, Wall Street, a lot of policymakers in Washington were hoping that the inflation uptick would be what they called transitory.
There was a decent amount of evidence to support that view that it would be temporary or transitory.
That it would come and go away. Well, that's not what happened.
To understand where inflation is spreading in the average American's household budget, we looked to the Labor Department's inflation metric, the Consumer Price Index. We came away with some surprises and some lessons that tell us how the story of inflation is changing. The inflation we're currently experiencing began as pandemic lockdown restrictions were lifted, triggering a boom in demand.
When inflation turned up in 2021, it was a different kind of inflation than what we're seeing right now. There were really two facets to it. One was we saw these idiosyncratic changes. For instance, used car prices jumped up, in part because there were shortages of new cars.
Supply chain bottlenecks and chip shortages pushed up prices for goods like cars, both new and old.
And then the other thing that we saw was prices for other goods jumping up. During the pandemic, people binged on goods. They couldn't go out to restaurants, they couldn't go to hotels. And so they ordered Amazon and the spending picked up on a lot of goods. And then as the pandemic receded a little bit, we had these supply shortages for imported goods in particular. So you saw things like furniture prices go up, apparel prices, shoe prices. Stuff that used to be really cheap because we were importing it from low-cost labor places was all of a sudden popping up.
But the inflation we've seen recently in 2022 is more severe and more wide-reaching.
Now we're seeing prices for services, like one of my favorite indicators is haircuts. For 20 years, the price of a haircut was going up between 0 and 4%. In this latest stage, they've gone up 5% because the cost of labor is going up.
Some of the most noticeable recent price hikes have been at the grocery store. 13% of the average American's household budget goes to food. And since last April, household food prices are up almost 11%.
Grocery prices were pretty tame actually last year, and what we've seen this year is increases at double-digit levels.
Since last year, prices for ground beef have risen almost 15%, and prices for chicken breasts are up 16.4%.
So meat is a very interesting case. When you're building a herd this year, you're building it for 2 or 3 years out. You have to have some view of what the world is going to look like in a couple of years. Cows don't grow overnight, right? In 2020, when some of these herds were being built, we were going into a devastating recession. Now, 2 years later, we're dealing with meat shortages because there's this undersupply of meat.
Meanwhile, a combination of factors caused gas prices to soar. The Russia's invasion of Ukraine earlier this year jolted the global market, prompting oil price increases.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine has taken things like gasoline prices from a stage where they were recovering from the pandemic to where they're much higher than they were before.
In late May, gasoline prices topped $4 a gallon in all 50 states for the first time ever. Currently, California leads the country with prices over $6.
The war in Ukraine has had a big impact on global energy markets. When COVID hit, we went into this global downturn. The price of gasoline in the U.S. went from around $3 a gallon to $2 a gallon. In 2021, by early 22, it was back up to over $3 a gallon, so there was a recovery. We had been through a full cycle. Then Russia invaded Ukraine, and now we have gasoline prices over $5 a gallon in many places.
Higher energy prices have also bled into air travel. Analysts say that rising fuel costs and staffing shortages have led to a spike in airfares. In April, airline fares surged 18.6% from a month earlier, the fastest rise on record.
Americans are really frustrated right now with what's happening, and one great place to see that is in what's happening at the airport. Flights are being canceled at the same time that airfares are going up.
We also found that the biggest budget item for most households, the cost of keeping a roof over your head, is heading up. Housing makes up 30% of the average household's budget, and it's up 5% from a year ago.
So rents are another facet of this inflation problem. It relates to undersupply of housing that was built really over the last 10 years since the 2008 financial crisis and led to less building for over a decade. And now we're paying a price for that because we're seeing price increases for homes, and that's feeding through into rental prices.
We now are entering a period of transition from one of historic recovery to one that can be marked by stable and steady growth. Making this shift is a central piece of the president's plan to get inflation under control without sacrificing the economic gains we've made.
As the country heads into the midterm election season, much of the political discussion is centered around the damaging impact of inflation.
I'm meeting with the chairman today and Secretary Yellen to discuss my top priority, and that is addressing inflation.
The Fed has shifted its strategy over the last few months. What they're trying to do now, and what they think they have to do, is hit the demand side of the economy. And they're going to do that by raising interest rates to make it more expensive to borrow. The Fed is trying to hit demand to slow growth, economic growth, just enough so that inflation comes down to more manageable levels of around 2% a year. So one risk is that they don't hit demand enough and inflation remains elevated. The other thing that could go wrong is that they hit demand so hard that not only do they bring down inflation, but they drive the whole economy into recession. And in that scenario, the real risk that people need to worry about is that in the process of going into a recession, they kill this great job market and unemployment starts rising.